It was a warm afternoon in late spring, the kind of ordinary weekday where routines blur together. In a quiet suburban town tucked between wooded backroads and small strip malls, 36-year-old Emily Carter left her office job at the insurance agency and headed straight for the grocery store. She had promised her kids their favorite pasta for dinner, and she was never the kind of mother to break small promises. Emily pulled into the crowded parking lot around 5:30, just when the sun was lowering, but the lot still bustled with shoppers finishing their errands before dinner. Nothing about the moment suggested anything unusual. She parked her silver sedan a few rows away from the entrance, locked it as always, and walked toward the automatic doors with her purse strapped firmly across her shoulder. Inside, Emily moved with quiet purpose, selecting a handful of items she needed: a box of pasta, fresh vegetables, milk, and a few snacks for the children's school lunches. She smiled politely to a cashier she knew in passing and exchanged a brief word with a neighbor she happened to pass in the aisle. To anyone who noticed her, she looked calm, ordinary, tired in the way working mothers often are at the end of the day. At 6 o'clock, she paid for her groceries, stuffed the receipt into her purse, and pushed the cart toward the exit. The cameras in the store captured her every step, her brown hair tucked neatly back, her face faintly smiling as she carried a single bag. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Emily's husband, Daniel, returned home from his construction job that evening, the house was strangely quiet. Their two children, ages 8 and 10, sat at the kitchen table with their backpacks still unopened, waiting for dinner. Daniel assumed his wife was delayed, but as the clock edged toward 7, unease crept in. By 8, he was pacing the living room, dialing her cell phone over and over. Each call went straight to voicemail. At 9, he drove to the grocery store himself, hoping to find her car broken down nearby, or perhaps to discover she had run into an old friend and lost track of time. What he found instead stopped him cold. There, in the same grocery store parking lot, sat Emily's silver sedan. The doors were locked, but the driver's side window was cracked slightly open. On the passenger seat sat her keyring and cell phone, as if hastily placed down. Inside the back seat were grocery bags, untouched, with milk slowly warming and vegetables still inside their plastic wrappers. The bag she had been carrying when she left the store was missing, but there were no signs of struggle. No broken glass, no tire marks, no witnesses waiting nearby to explain what had happened. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air between the automatic doors and her car. Daniel immediately called the police. Officers arrived within the hour, securing the vehicle and marking off a small perimeter with tape. They questioned late shoppers and clerks still closing the store, but nobody recalled seeing anything unusual. A few thought they might have seen Emily walking with her grocery bag, but no one could remember where she went after stepping outside. Surveillance footage confirmed she left the checkout, but outside the doors, the cameras left a blind spot that stretched across a section of the lot. Investigators combed the footage, frame by frame, but there was no image of her getting into her car, no image of her being forced into another vehicle. The trail simply ended at the sliding doors. By midnight, a missing person alert was issued. Officers walked the perimeter of the lot with flashlights, searching ditches and wooded edges nearby. Bloodhounds were called in, sniffing around the car for her scent. They followed it briefly across the lot, but it dissolved near the exit lane, as though she had either entered another car or her scent had been scattered by the dozens of people coming and going that evening. Family members began arriving at the scene, voices breaking as they asked questions that no one could answer. Was it possible she left willingly? Could she have been kidnapped in plain sight? The thought seemed impossible, yet the absence of any other explanation left terror in its place. The following morning, the story broke across local news channels. Mother of 2 vanishes from grocery parking lot, the headlines read, accompanied by the smiling photo of Emily that her family provided. Volunteers gathered to organize searches of nearby parks and trails. Helicopters swept the riverbank. Officers knocked on doors in the neighborhood surrounding the store, hoping someone had seen her walking or being approached. For the children, the days blurred in confusion and fear. Their mother had been there one moment and gone the next, with no good reason to explain why she hadn't come home. The most haunting detail for investigators was the state of her car. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed, no fingerprints beyond her own and the family's, no forced entry. The groceries in the back seat suggested she had made it to her vehicle but had not placed everything inside before something interrupted her. The missing bag she was last seen holding raised further questions. Was it taken by her? Was it dropped or disposed of by someone else? For the family, the sight of those groceries left a permanent mark, dinner ingredients waiting for a meal that would never be cooked. As the first 48 hours passed with no leads, the case began to shift in tone. Detectives still believed abduction was possible, but the absence of witnesses in a crowded lot was baffling. Theories multiplied: a stranger lurking nearby, a targeted attack, or perhaps someone she knew. To the family, each theory felt unbearable, yet all were preferable to the hollow silence of not knowing. Emily Carter had walked into the store with the weight of her ordinary life on her shoulders and stepped back into a world that somehow swallowed her whole. And within that gap of minutes between checkout and the driver's seat, a decade-long mystery was born, one that would haunt her family every single day until a secret, hidden above their heads, threatened to unravel everything. Detectives began with the one thing they could rely on: the timeline. In any disappearance, narrowing down the last confirmed movements is crucial, and for Emily Carter, those movements were captured in grainy black and white security footage from the grocery store. The cameras clearly showed her walking in at 5:34 p.m., browsing through the aisles with quiet efficiency, and finally arriving at the checkout counter just after 6. She paid for her items with her debit card, smiled briefly at the cashier, and then lifted a single bag in her hand as she headed toward the sliding doors. That was the last confirmed image. The cameras outside, angled toward the parking lot, failed to pick her up. It was as if she had stepped into a blind spot and simply never emerged. Investigators scoured every second of available footage, replaying the angles repeatedly. They noted the cars that came and went, the pedestrians walking past, the flickering shadows across the pavement as the evening sun dipped lower. But there was no trace of Emily. For her family, watching those images was excruciating. Seeing her alive, moving with purpose, and then disappearing at the exact place where the cameras failed to reach. That absence became the focal point of the investigation. How could someone vanish in a busy public place with no one noticing? The detectives turned next to witnesses. Clerks who had seen her in line remembered nothing unusual. A teenage bag boy thought he saw her pause near the doors as if waiting for someone. Another customer recalled a woman in a light jacket walking past her car carrying a bag, though she couldn't be certain it was Emily. The accounts were inconsistent, fragmented impressions of a fleeting moment that refused to settle into certainty. Still, they all suggested she had made it out of the store and into the open air of the lot. What happened in the minutes that followed was anyone's guess. The parking lot itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Officers canvassed every angle, searching for overlooked cameras from nearby businesses. A pharmacy across the street had a unit pointed in the general direction of the lot, but the resolution was poor and the timestamp unreliable. They believed they saw Emily's silver sedan parked in its spot, but the footage cut out before anything useful could be captured. Detectives drove the path she might have walked, noting how the grocery store's coverage left significant gaps where a person could move unseen. It was in one of those gaps, they believed, that Emily's story turned into a mystery. Theories began to emerge. One suggested she was lured into another vehicle, perhaps someone she knew pulled up beside her, offering a ride or initiating a conversation, and she stepped closer, bag in hand. Another theory imagined a stranger waiting for her, forcing her into their car so quickly and quietly that no one noticed. The darker possibility lingered that she might have left willingly, abandoning her groceries and her family for reasons no one understood. That notion was painful for her loved ones, but detectives could not afford to dismiss it. Every possibility had to remain open. As investigators pressed forward, the community around them buzzed with rumor. A story like this doesn't stay confined to police reports. It spills into diners, classrooms, and workplaces. Some whispered that Emily had been struggling at home and wanted to escape. Others were convinced a dangerous stranger was stalking the parking lots in town, waiting for a lone woman at dusk. Parents grew wary of errands after dark, and women began scanning their surroundings with heightened caution. Fear spread almost as fast as speculation. The absence of answers left a vacuum that gossip eagerly filled. Daniel Carter, Emily's husband, became increasingly restless under the weight of suspicion. He stood outside their home, night after night, fielding questions from reporters, insisting she would never have left her children. He repeated his words like a mantra. She was taken, not gone by choice. Detectives listened carefully but remained cautious. In many disappearances, the spouse is the first person to investigate, and though there was no evidence against him, the possibility could not be ignored. Every move he made was quietly scrutinized. Forensic teams returned to Emily's vehicle in the lot, combing it once again for overlooked traces. They dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for DNA, examined the locks and handles. Nothing suggested forced entry, and the items inside were so mundane they almost felt mocking. Groceries, receipts, an umbrella shoved beneath the seat. The only irregular detail was the missing bag she had carried when leaving the store. If she had made it to the car, why was that bag not with the others in the back seat? Had she set it down somewhere, or had it been taken along with her? That small, missing detail gnawed at the case like an unanswered riddle. The investigation leaned heavily on time. Between the moment she left the checkout at 6:02 p.m. and the time Daniel discovered her car after 8, there were 2 full hours in which Emily vanished without a trace. Detectives mapped out every possible route she could have taken, interviewing strangers who had been in the lot, re-interviewing employees in case something had been overlooked. Yet each lead ended the same way, with uncertainty and silence. The trail was cold before it had even begun. For the Carter children, those days became a blur of police cars, late-night phone calls, and the absence of their mother's voice echoing through the house. Neighbors tried to shield them, offering comfort and distraction, but the weight of the unknown pressed down on them in ways too heavy for their young shoulders. The daughter clung to the belief that her mother was alive somewhere, while the son began asking darker questions no one could answer. The family's fragile balance shifted under the pressure of not knowing. In the first week of the investigation, detectives admitted the obvious. Emily Carter had disappeared in a span of minutes, and beyond the checkout footage, nothing confirmed her fate. The vanishing point lay in a blind spot of the parking lot, a place where ordinary routines met the kind of silence that swallows entire lives. That silence, filled with unanswered questions, would become the foundation of every lead that followed. And as rumors continued to multiply, investigators realized the deeper danger wasn't just what happened in that parking lot, but how little evidence remained to explain it. By the third day, the case of Emily Carter's disappearance was no longer just a local headline. Her photograph appeared on evening broadcasts across the state, her name echoing through police scanners, newsrooms, and whispered conversations in gas stations. Search efforts grew into a coordinated operation. Officers established a command post near the grocery store, and from there, teams fanned out into the surrounding woods, fields, and riverbanks. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights combing the terrain long after dusk. Bloodhounds were brought back, their noses pressed to articles of Emily's clothing in hopes of catching a trace that might lead investigators to her. Volunteers poured in, some neighbors, some strangers, all eager to help a family whose life had been ruptured without warning. Despite the manpower, the silence was suffocating. No footprints, no discarded items, no broken branches suggesting a struggle through the woods. The rivers nearby ran calm and offered no trace of clothing or personal belongings. Officers dragged shallow sections and scanned deeper areas with sonar, but the screens remained empty of answers. Each day ended with weary volunteers walking back toward their cars, faces drawn with disappointment. Emily's family stood at the edges of these searches, hoping for any word, any object, even a scrap of clothing that could anchor them to the truth. But nothing came. Detectives shifted focus to those closest to her. In most cases, they knew, answers did not lie in forests or rivers, but in homes and relationships. They began with Daniel, her husband. He repeated to them what he had already told reporters: Emily would never leave their children willingly, and she had no reason to run away. He insisted she was happy, grounded, devoted to the family. Yet, detectives noted the unease in his posture, the fatigue in his answers. When pressed about their marriage, he admitted there had been arguments, especially about finances. The construction business he worked for had suffered during the last recession, and money was tight. Bills piled higher than they liked to admit. But, he claimed, Emily never threatened to leave. Detectives checked financial records. They found overdue utility payments, a maxed-out credit card, and a mortgage under strain. They also learned that in the weeks before her disappearance, Emily had confided to a close friend that she felt exhausted by the weight of it all. "Sometimes I just want to walk away for a while," the friend recalled her saying. It wasn't a plan, but a sigh from a woman carrying more than her share. Investigators could not ignore that detail. For every theory of abduction, there lingered another. Perhaps she had stepped willingly into a different life, one beyond her family's reach. Friends painted a more complicated portrait. Emily was devoted to her children, yes, but she was also quietly restless. She worked long hours at the insurance office, managed the household, and still found herself cleaning late into the night. Some friends remembered her laughing, vibrant, the kind of woman who made others feel at ease. Others remembered her distracted, her eyes drifting to some unseen thought. The duality of her life emerged in interviews. One woman anchored by responsibility, another quietly longing for escape. Detectives also considered the possibility of external danger. Grocery store employees were interviewed again, asked whether anyone had been watching Emily that day. A cashier recalled a man lingering near the entrance, though his description was vague. Another shopper thought they saw her talking briefly with someone in the lot, but they couldn't describe the person with certainty. These fragments, offered days later, were hard to weigh. Memory, investigators knew, was fickle, and every retelling grew less reliable. Still, the idea that Emily may have encountered someone she knew could not be ruled out. As the investigation dragged into its second week, public attention intensified. Posters with her face were stapled to telephone poles, taped to diner windows, pinned to community boards and churches. Strangers dropped off food at the Carter home, while others whispered suspicions behind closed doors. Some questioned whether Daniel was telling the whole truth. Others speculated about secret struggles Emily may have hidden. In the absence of evidence, rumor became its own kind of investigation, messy and relentless. Inside the Carter household, the silence deepened. The children asked questions no parent could answer. Every knock at the door sent them racing, only to sag with disappointment. Daniel grew thinner, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. He welcomed detectives when they arrived, but the weight of their questions chipped at his composure. Each time they asked about arguments, about late-night absences, about whether Emily seemed different in the days before, his frustration grew. He swore he had nothing to hide, but detectives remained cautious. In their world, appearances rarely aligned with truth. The weeks that followed were marked by false hope. A woman resembling Emily was spotted at a rest stop an hour away, leading to a frantic search that ended in nothing. Another tip claimed she'd been seen entering a pickup truck near a county line, but the truck was never identified. Each lead gave the family a surge of desperate hope, only to collapse into the same silence. For investigators, this cycle became familiar. Chase, disappointment, repeat. As summer deepened, the momentum of the search slowed. Volunteers returned to their lives, media coverage dwindled, and the once bustling command post emptied out. The investigation remained open, but without new evidence, it began to stall. Emily's face, once vivid on posters and broadcasts, now faded in the background noise of unsolved cases. For her family, though, the silence was unbearable. The unanswered question of whether she had been taken or had chosen to leave tore at them daily. Each theory cut a different wound, and neither offered peace. In the minds of detectives, the case had reached a troubling crossroads. If Emily had been abducted, evidence should have surfaced by now. If she had left willingly, some trace, a bank withdrawal, a phone call, a new life somewhere, should have emerged. Instead, there was nothing. The silence itself became the most haunting evidence of all, a void where a mother, a wife, and a friend should have been. And it was within that silence that investigators realized the search was no longer about where she had gone, but about who truly knew her well enough to explain why. As the weeks turned into months, investigators began to shift their focus. With no trace of Emily in the woods, rivers, or highways, attention naturally turned inward, to the people closest to her. It was not unusual. In many disappearances, answers were found not in the shadows of parking lots, but inside the walls of the home. For detectives, the line between victim and suspect often blurred, and the person reporting the tragedy sometimes carried pieces of the truth they were unwilling to share. In Emily's case, suspicion began to drift toward Daniel Carter. The community's whispers grew louder as time passed without resolution. Neighbors recalled arguments they'd overheard through thin summer nights, raised voices, slamming doors. A co-worker admitted Emily once hinted she felt trapped, though she never elaborated. For police, these details fed into a working theory. Perhaps her disappearance was not the work of a stranger, but a staged event, meant to look like abduction while hiding something darker. If her husband was involved, it might explain the precision, the lack of evidence, the silence that followed. Detectives pressed Daniel harder. They walked him through the night she vanished again and again, examining every detail for cracks. He repeated the same story. He came home from work, found her missing, and went searching himself. He was the one who discovered her car, the groceries, the phone. His voice wavered as he insisted he had no reason to harm her. He reminded them he had passed a polygraph test. But detectives knew polygraphs were not absolution. Stress, grief, or even a skilled liar could all bend the machine. What mattered was motive, and the cracks in their finances, the stress of bills, and the rumors of marital strain gave investigators reasons to look closer. The Carter home became a place of constant intrusion. Search warrants allowed officers to sweep through rooms, closets, and even the attic. They combed for fibers, stains, hidden compartments, yet nothing definitive surfaced. Friends who once stopped by with casseroles now eyed Daniel with quiet suspicion, uncertain whether they were comforting a grieving husband or standing beside a man hiding secrets. The children, caught in the middle, clung to their father but heard the whispers that followed them in school hallways. Their lives became defined by two questions. Where was their mother? And what role, if any, did their father play? Daniel's anger began to show. Each time he was called back to the station, he protested that police were wasting precious time chasing him while the real danger remained at large. He pointed to the missing bag, the lack of evidence in the car, the witnesses who thought they saw Emily near the exit, details that, to him, proved an abductor had taken her. Yet, detectives countered with their own logic. If it were an abduction, why had no one seen a struggle? Why had there been no ransom demand, no trace left behind? Crimes committed in public usually left marks. Emily's case left none. The strain fractured his relationship with Emily's extended family. Her parents, once supportive, began to wonder if police were right. Her mother tearfully admitted she had sometimes worried about Daniel's temper. Her father, more cautious, refused to believe his son-in-law capable of violence, but conceded the possibility could not be dismissed. This divide deepened the pain, leaving the children stranded between suspicion and loyalty. Every family gathering became another trial, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. Media coverage fueled the fire. Headlines shifted tone from missing mother to husband under scrutiny. Reporters camped outside the Carter home, capturing images of Daniel leaving for work, his head lowered, jaw tight. Talk shows debated whether he was a grieving spouse or a man masking guilt. The pressure grew suffocating. To Daniel, it felt like the town had already judged him guilty without a verdict. To detectives, the constant attention only reinforced the urgency to find answers, one way or another. As the investigation stretched into its second year, momentum slowed. Detectives who had once pushed aggressively began rotating off the case, replaced by fresh faces who saw the same dead ends. Each new officer circled back to the same point: Daniel. Yet without evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. No charges were filed, no handcuffs were placed. The case lingered in limbo, unresolved but not forgotten. For the family, that limbo was the most punishing sentence of all. Meanwhile, Daniel withdrew further into himself. Friends noticed his once steady presence at community events fading. He stopped answering phone calls from reporters, avoided neighbors, and focused on holding his fractured household together. The children, now growing older, carried the stigma of being the family with the missing mom. For them, every milestone, birthdays, graduations, was marked by an empty chair and unanswered questions. And beneath it all, the gnawing doubt about their father lingered. Was he telling the truth, or was he the reason their lives had been dismantled? Detectives never officially cleared him. Each year, when the anniversary of Emily's disappearance approached, they revisited the file, looking for overlooked details. Theories were revisited, timelines redrawn. But the trail, already thin, remained cold. For the community, the case became part of the town's folklore, an open wound, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers. For the Carter family, it remained an open cage, trapping them in suspicion and grief. Yet, even in that silence, there were details that refused to fade. The missing bag, the blind spot in the cameras, the car, groceries untouched, keys on the seat, details that suggested the story was not as simple as investigators believed. The absence of evidence against Daniel was not proof of innocence, but neither was it proof of guilt. It was, instead, a void, one that only deepened as years passed. And in that void, hope and suspicion lived side by side, feeding each other in ways that made moving forward impossible. It would take nearly a decade before a hidden truth, buried above their heads, would force that void open. And when it did, the suspicions that once seemed unbearable would be overshadowed by a revelation no one was prepared to face. As years slipped by, Emily Carter's disappearance refused to fade. Though the initial search efforts had dwindled, the mystery still clung to her family and the town. Every so often, a new lead would surface, pulling investigators and loved ones back into a cycle of fragile hope and crushing disappointment. It was during these years that what became known as the false trails began, and each one left scars deeper than the last. The first sighting came less than a year after she vanished. A woman matching Emily's description was reported at a truck stop 2 counties over. She had been seen with a man boarding a semi, carrying only a purse. The tip set off a flurry of activity. Detectives traveled to the location, interviewed employees, and pulled grainy security footage. For a moment, it seemed plausible. The woman's build was similar, the hair the same length. But when the footage was enhanced, the resemblance fell apart. It wasn't Emily. To the Carter family, the letdown was devastating. For the children, then still young enough to believe in miracles, it was a cruel reminder that the world could offer hope one moment and strip it away the next. Months later, another report surfaced, this time in a neighboring state where a woman had been spotted at a shelter, disoriented, claiming she had no memory of her past. Volunteers insisted it could be Emily, finally resurfaced after years of silence. Detectives arranged for a meeting, and the woman was cooperative. But within minutes, the truth emerged. It was someone else entirely, a runaway with her own tragic story. The disappointment rippled back home like a second loss. Each time a lead collapsed, it left the family emptier than before, as if Emily had been stolen from them all over again. Detectives knew the dangers of chasing endless sightings. Missing persons cases attracted them like moths to light. Some were genuine mistakes, others outright fabrications. But investigators still had to pursue each one because any could have been the breakthrough they were waiting for. In Emily's case, each new lead generated media attention, forcing the family back into the public eye. Each time, Daniel Carter found himself answering the same painful questions. What would it mean if she had left willingly? What would it mean if she hadn't? The pressure cracked open the fissures in the family, widening them year by year. The children grew up under the shadow of those false trails. Every phone call from detectives, every knock at the door, was met with a mix of anticipation and dread. At school, classmates whispered, speculating that their mother had abandoned them. The daughter clung fiercely to the idea that Emily was alive somewhere, lost but waiting to be found. The son, growing older and more skeptical, began to believe the worst, that his mother had been killed, and the truth was being hidden. These opposing beliefs created tension between them, arguments that erupted late at night when the house grew too quiet. Their grief had fractured into different shapes, but both were sharpened by the same unanswered question. Through it all, Daniel's name remained tangled in suspicion. Though investigators could never prove his involvement, the lack of resolution kept his reputation under a cloud. Friends grew distant, co-workers treated him cautiously, and even within his own extended family, doubts lingered. Some relatives whispered that maybe Emily had left of her own accord, tired of the marriage, perhaps even running away with another man. Others couldn't reconcile that idea with her devotion to her children. The speculation eroded the foundation of trust within the family. For the Carter children, it meant growing up in a house divided not only by absence, but by accusation. One of the most painful episodes came 5 years into the EBO investigation, when a decomposed body was discovered in a wooded area not far from the interstate. The remains matched Emily's general age and build. Investigators prepared the family for the worst, taking DNA samples for comparison. For weeks, the family lived in suspended horror, awaiting the results. When they came back, relief mingled with fresh grief. It wasn't Emily. For her loved ones, this meant she was still out there, but the reprieve came with no answers, only more waiting. The case remained as stagnant as ever. Detectives cycled through theories. Some believed Emily had run away with someone, perhaps the man in the torn photograph later discovered. Others insisted she had been the victim of a random abduction. Still others leaned toward the idea that the truth lay within the family all along, hidden in plain sight. Each theory shaped the trajectory of the case, but none produced evidence strong enough to move forward. It was a constant circle of questions without closure. By the 7th year, the case file had swollen to thousands of pages, interviews, tips, maps, photographs, all leading nowhere. Cold case detectives reviewed it with fresh eyes, but even they reached the same impasse. Without a body, without a confession, without clear forensic evidence, Emily Carter's disappearance remained a void. The grocery store parking lot stood frozen in memory, a stage for an event no one could replay clearly enough to understand. And in that absence, the false trails multiplied, leaving the family worn down by the very hope that once sustained them. For the community, Emily's case became less about an active investigation and more about a ghostly reminder that ordinary life could unravel in minutes. The grocery store where she vanished carried a heavy silence in its lot. Shoppers glanced over their shoulders more often, mothers clutched their children's hands a little tighter, and whispers of Emily's name lingered long after her face faded from posters. In the Carter household, the weight of those years never lifted. The unanswered questions were as much a part of daily life as meals or bills. Each false lead chipped away at their resilience until even hope felt like a betrayal. And yet, time pressed forward. The children grew into teenagers, their grief reshaped into sharper edges. Daniel aged under suspicion and silence, his life marked not by what he had done, but by what no one could prove. Each false trail had left them emptier, angrier, more fractured, but none of them could have imagined that the real clue, the one that would shatter a decade of silence, was not in distant towns or wooded highways, but resting quietly above their heads, sealed away in the attic of their own home. 10 years after Emily Carter walked out of a grocery store and into silence, her family still lived in the shadow of her absence. Time had aged them, but it had not softened the grief. Her husband, Daniel, now in his late 40s, carried the weight of suspicion like a second skin. Neighbors no longer whispered as loudly, but the stares never truly stopped. At work, he kept his head down, avoiding conversations, moving through his days with a numb precision. Inside the house, he grew quieter, retreating into himself, until the man he had once been was barely recognizable. His children, who had been small when Emily vanished, were now teenagers facing adulthood, with lives defined by a mother they could barely remember and a father who could not escape the accusations that clung to him. The house they lived in bore the weight of those years too. Paint peeled from corners, carpets had grown threadbare, and boxes of untouched belongings gathered dust in the attic and basement. It was a house filled with echoes, of arguments once overheard, of birthdays marked by empty chairs, of detectives pacing the living room with clipboards in hand. By the 10th year, the family decided it was time to let go. Selling the house was as much a financial decision as it was an emotional one. The walls carried too much memory, too much silence. But preparing to leave meant reopening boxes that had been closed since the days after Emily's disappearance, and with every lid lifted, old wounds split open. The daughter, now 17, had become the keeper of hope. She still believed her mother might be alive somewhere, lost but not gone forever. She carried Emily's photographs in her wallet, kept her jewelry in a small box by her bed, and scoured online forums for stories of women who resurfaced years after vanishing. To her, moving out of the house felt like abandoning the search. Each drawer she opened, each sweater she unfolded, was a connection to the mother she still imagined returning one day. She pleaded with her father not to sell, clinging to the idea that Emily might walk back through the front door and need the home to still be there. Her brother, just 2 years older, had grown more pragmatic and darker. For him, the years of false sightings and dead ends had hardened into certainty. He believed their mother had been murdered. The missing bag, the silence, the absence of any trace, these were not the signs of a woman who left willingly, but of someone whose life had been taken. He did not share his sister's faith in miracles. Instead, he spoke of closure, of the need to accept the truth no matter how painful. To him, selling the house was not betrayal, but survival. It was a chance to leave behind walls that had become prisons of memory. Their father watched these arguments unfold, too exhausted to intervene. He understood both sides because he lived in both worlds himself. Some days he imagined Emily alive, perhaps in another town, living under another name. Other days he convinced himself she had died that night in the parking lot, and he tortured himself with images of what her final moments might have been. He had no answers for his children, and his silence only deepened the divide between them. The family was united by grief, but fractured by belief, each clinging to a version of the truth that kept them moving forward. As the move drew closer, the process of packing became a ritual of revisiting the past. The attic, in particular, was a minefield. Boxes of Christmas decorations sat beside crates of Emily's books, her handwriting still visible on the flaps. Old school projects from the children's early years were tucked into corners, untouched since the days when she had proudly displayed them on the fridge. Every item carried weight, each one sparking arguments about whether to keep or discard. The daughter wanted to save everything. The son insisted on leaving the past behind. The tension in the attic became unbearable, as though the air itself was thick with unspoken words. It was in that attic, among the dust and boxes, that the first signs of what had been hidden all along began to surface. The daughter, rummaging through old suitcases, noticed how certain sections of the floor creaked differently. She pressed her hand to a corner panel, hearing the hollow sound beneath. She mentioned it in passing, but her brother brushed it off, chalking it up to an old house settling. Still, something about that sound lingered in her mind. In the weeks ahead, as more boxes were lifted and the move grew imminent, her curiosity about that hidden space deepened. For the family, the attic had always been just storage, a place where they tucked away things they didn't want to face. But now, with every step closer to leaving, it became something more. Each trip up the ladder felt like entering a space thick with secrets. They didn't know it yet, but the attic was not just a room above their heads. It was a silent witness to everything they had endured, holding within it a truth that would shatter their fragile beliefs about Emily's fate. By the time the house was nearly emptied, emotions were running raw. The daughter grew more insistent about searching the attic thoroughly before they left, convinced that if her mother had left any trace behind, it would be there. Her brother, tired of hope, argued against it. Their father, worn down by years of grief, said little, but his silence gave her permission to keep looking. The attic, once an afterthought, now loomed as the last place they had not fully faced, and within its dusty beams and forgotten corners, the family's long divide would soon collide with a disturbing discovery that neither hope nor doubt could prepare them for. The attic had always been the most avoided space in the Carter home. It was hot in the summers, cold in the winters, and carried a smell of dust and wood that seemed untouched since the house was first built. For years it had served as a dumping ground for boxes that no one wanted to deal with: holiday decorations, old clothes, broken toys, and furniture too sentimental to throw away. But as the family prepared to sell the house, the attic became unavoidable. Every box had to be opened, every item sorted, every corner checked. And in that process, the attic revealed its first secret. The daughter, still restless with hope, was the one who noticed it. She'd been kneeling near a far corner, moving aside a stack of old suitcases, when her hand pressed against a section of the floorboards that sounded different. A hollow thud, unlike the solid wood around it. She tapped it again, pausing. Her brother, watching from across the attic, told her it was nothing, just the creaks of an aging house. But something about the sound lingered in her mind. She brushed away dust, running her fingers along the paneling of the wall beside her. And that's when she saw it. A faint line, an uneven seam in the wood that looked out of place. At first, she thought it was just warped timber, but curiosity pulled her closer. She pressed against the seam, and the panel shifted slightly, as if it had been forced shut years ago. Her heart began to race. She called her brother over, but he shook his head, irritated by her determination to see signs where none existed. He reminded her that people had lived in the house long before them, that the attic probably still held forgotten things from generations past. But she couldn't shake the unease. She wedged her fingers into the seam and pulled. The wood groaned as the panel gave way, and behind it, wedged tightly between beams, was a small trunk. It was no bigger than a carry-on suitcase, its surface covered in dust so thick it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A rusted lock sealed it shut, though the metal looked fragile with age. The daughter stared at it, her pulse quickening. Her brother muttered that it was probably just junk, something left behind by their grandparents or the house's previous owners. Their father, watching from the ladder, agreed. He said they didn't need to open every old box, that they had enough to sort through already. But the daughter couldn't let it go. She insisted. Something about the trunk felt different, deliberately hidden, wedged away where no one would ever casually find it. After a long silence, her father sighed and gave in. They carried the trunk to the center of the attic. The lock resisted at first, but with pressure and a screwdriver, it snapped open. The creak of the hinges broke through the attic stillness as the lid lifted, and the smell of old fabric and paper wafted out. Inside, neatly folded, were women's clothes. Dresses, blouses, a scarf, all carefully placed in layers as if someone had packed them with intention. The daughter's breath caught. They weren't vintage. They weren't relics from some forgotten era. They looked like clothes from 10 years ago, clothes her mother might have worn. Her brother froze, staring at the contents. His first instinct was denial, to believe it was coincidence, that these items belonged to someone else entirely. But when the daughter reached deeper, she found notebooks, their covers bent and worn, the handwriting inside instantly familiar. Notes, grocery lists, reminders, written in her mother's hand. She recognized the curves of the letters, the way Emily always looped her Y's. These were not distant relics. These were hers. The family fell silent. The father's face drained of color as he stared into the trunk, his eyes locked on the personal items he hadn't seen in a decade. He whispered that it must be a mistake, that the police had searched the house top to bottom, that nothing like this had ever been found. Yet here it was, sealed away in a place no one had thought to look. The daughter pulled out another item, a small stack of papers folded neatly, tied with string. Personal notes. Some were shopping lists, others half-written letters, unfinished thoughts on lined paper. They spoke of daily life, milk, bills, reminders to call a friend, but woven into them were more private words, mentions of fear, of doubt, of feeling watched. Her brother shifted uneasily, his skepticism fading into unease. These were not artifacts of a stranger. These were fragments of their mother's life, frozen in time and hidden in their own attic. But the trunk did not end with clothing and notes. At the very bottom, beneath the layers, lay something that chilled them all, a photograph, torn in half. The image showed Emily, smiling, with a man none of them immediately recognized. His arm was around her shoulders, but the rip in the photo had violently separated his face from hers. The edges were jagged, the tear deliberate. The daughter's hands trembled as she held it up to the light, her voice catching as she asked who he was. No one answered. The attic, filled with the hum of silence, pressed down on them as the realization sank in. This was not forgotten storage. It was a secret, buried deliberately above their heads for 10 years. The clothes, the notes, the torn photograph, each piece was personal, intimate, and incriminating. The family had stumbled onto something that changed everything they thought they knew about Emily's disappearance. The questions that haunted them for a decade had just been ripped open again, sharper and darker than before. And as they stared into the trunk, one thing became undeniable. The attic was no longer just a place of dust and memory. It was now the epicenter of a truth they had spent 10 years searching for, and what they had found inside was only the beginning of what would be revealed. The trunk sat open in the attic, its contents spread out across the dusty floorboards, but the daughter's trembling hands went still when she reached the very bottom. Beneath the folded clothes and the stack of notes was something small, leather, and familiar. She pulled it out slowly, and when the light caught it, her brother froze. It was their mother's purse, the one she'd been carrying the day she vanished. For 10 years. Detectives and family alike had wondered what became of it. It had not been found in her car, not recovered in the grocery lot, not listed among the missing items. And now, after a decade of searching, here it was, sealed away above their heads. The daughter unzipped it with shaking fingers. Inside were objects that should have been lost to time but remained intact, as though Emily herself had packed them only yesterday. Her driver's license, edges worn but unmistakable, sat in a plastic sleeve. Credit cards long expired, but bearing her name. Receipts from the week of her disappearance, lipstick she favored, the cap still smudged. Each item confirmed what they already knew but couldn't believe. This was not a coincidence. These were not random objects from another life. This was their mother's purse, deliberately hidden in the attic of the home she left behind. What unsettled them most were the papers tucked into one of the side pockets. At first, they looked like simple scraps, folded and creased with time. But as they unfolded them, the truth emerged. Half-written letters, never sent. Some were addressed vaguely, with no names, but the handwriting was undeniably hers. In them, Emily described feeling afraid, feeling cornered. She wrote about a secret she couldn't share, about someone who made her feel both alive and in danger. The letters stopped mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. The daughter's eyes scanned them again and again, searching for clarity, but they only raised more questions. Among the papers was the torn photograph they had already seen, now fully revealed. It showed Emily, smiling in a way her children barely remembered, her arm around a man whose face was partly ripped away by the jagged tear. The act of tearing seemed deliberate, an attempt to erase his identity. Whoever he was, he mattered. Whoever he was, he had been important enough to capture in a photograph, only to be violently removed from it later. The daughter asked her father if he recognized him. Daniel's face hardened as he stared at the image, but his answer came slowly, weighed down with something unspoken. He said he didn't know. The children weren't sure they believed him. the attic filled with silence, thick and suffocating. The purse wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was a piece of evidence that had never been accounted for. How could it have been hidden here, in their home, when police had conducted exhaustive searches years earlier? Officers had combed through every room, every closet, even the attic itself. Yet somehow this trunk had gone undiscovered. The implications were staggering. Either the search had missed it, or someone had hidden it there later, deliberately, after the fact. Suspicion shifted like a current through the family. The daughter clutched the purse, her mind racing with possibilities. Could her mother have returned to the house in secret? Could she have hidden her belongings before fleeing for reasons no one yet understood? The idea gave her a flicker of hope, that Emily had been alive, if only for a short while, after that night in the grocery lot. But her brother's thoughts turned darker. If the purse had been hidden intentionally, it meant someone inside the house might have known more than they ever admitted. To him, it pointed directly to their father. Daniel's reaction only deepened the tension. He insisted he had never seen the trunk before, that he had no idea how it came to be there. But his words, already weakened by years of suspicion, carried little weight. His son watched him with cold eyes, silently accusing. His daughter, torn between hope and fear, refused to believe her father could have kept such a secret. The attic, once just a place of forgotten storage, became the stage for a family breaking apart in real time. When the trunk was finally carried downstairs, the atmosphere in the house shifted permanently. The purse was more than an object. It was a direct link to Emily's last known moments, a thread connecting the day she vanished to the home she had left behind. The discovery forced detectives back into the case, reopening files long considered stagnant. Forensic teams were called to examine the items, to test for prints, to determine how long they had been hidden. But for the family, no scientific test could erase the haunting question: who had put it there? Neighbors whispered again. Friends called with cautious curiosity. News outlets revisited the case, framing the attic discovery as a chilling new chapter in a decade-old mystery. And for the Carter children, the world once again turned its eyes toward them, demanding answers they didn't have. The daughter clung to the idea that this meant her mother had been alive longer than anyone thought. The son, hardened by years of false hope, believed it confirmed something far worse, that the truth of her death had been close all along, buried inside their own house. The disturbing clue shifted everything. The purse, the license, the torn photograph, they were no longer chasing shadows. They were staring at tangible pieces of a puzzle hidden deliberately from them. And as detectives carried the evidence away, promising to uncover what it meant, the family was left with a truth more unsettling than the silence they had endured for 10 years. If these belongings had been inside their attic all this time, then the person who had hidden them had not been far away. The mystery was no longer only about where Emily had gone, but about who inside her life had known more than they ever dared to reveal. The discovery of the trunk forced the case back into motion. After 10 years of silence, detectives were once again walking through the Carter home, this time with gloves, evidence bags, and a new sense of urgency. The purse, the notes, and the torn photograph were treated like relics, sealed and cataloged, carried carefully into forensic labs. For the family, watching the evidence leave the house was both relieving and horrifying. At last, there was something tangible, proof that Emily had left behind more than silence. But the fact that these items had been hidden in their attic meant that someone close had placed them there. The mystery no longer felt distant. It was inside their own walls. Forensic teams examined every detail. Dust analysis revealed that the trunk had not been disturbed for nearly a decade. The particles layered on its surface aligned with the timeline of Emily's disappearance. That meant it had been hidden very close to the time she vanished, then left untouched. Whoever placed it there had done so deliberately, intending for it never to be found. Even more chilling were the letters. Analysts confirmed the handwriting matched samples of Emily's. The tone was uneven, shifting between everyday lists and haunting admissions. In one letter, she wrote about fear of Daniel discovering something she had been hiding. She mentioned a man, unnamed, someone she felt both drawn to and endangered by. She hinted at plans to leave, but the words ended abruptly, cut short mid-sentence. It was enough to suggest that Emily's disappearance was not the random act of a stranger, but rooted in the turmoil of her private life. Detectives turned their attention to the torn photograph. Technicians scanned and reconstructed the image, piecing together the missing half. It was not a stranger. It was someone familiar, someone investigators had spoken to 10 years earlier and dismissed, a man who had worked with Emily at the grocery store. His name was Paul Harrison. At the time of her disappearance, he was a young stock clerk in his 20s, barely noticed amid the chaos of interviews. He had given a brief statement saying he remembered seeing her in the store that day but nothing else. Now, with his image surfaced in an intimate photograph, his role in her life demanded a closer look. Detectives tracked Paul down. He no longer worked at the store. He had left the area a few years after Emily vanished, moving 2 towns over where he lived quietly with a new family. When investigators arrived at his door, his demeanor cracked under their questions. At first, he denied knowing anything beyond what he'd said a decade ago. But when shown the torn photograph, his face drained of color. Confronted with the evidence, he finally admitted the truth. He and Emily had been secretly seeing each other in the months before she disappeared. The admission sent shockwaves through the investigation. For years, speculation had circled around Daniel, around strangers, around random violence. Few had considered that Emily had been entangled in a quiet affair with a co-worker. Paul described it as a relationship born of stress and secrecy. Emily had confided in him about the strain at home, about the arguments, about feeling trapped. She spoke of wanting to leave, of starting over. According to Paul, the night she vanished, she had planned to meet him after her grocery run. Together, they were going to leave the town behind. But Paul insisted she never showed up. He claimed he waited, growing anxious as the hours passed, but Emily never arrived. The next morning, when he saw the news of her disappearance, he panicked. Fearing he would be blamed, he destroyed most of the evidence of their relationship, except for the photograph, which he said Emily had torn in anger during an argument. His confession complicated everything. On one hand, it aligned with the contents of the trunk, the letters about fear, the torn photograph, the hints of another life she had been planning. On the other, it left investigators with more questions. If she truly intended to leave with him that night, why had she vanished from the parking lot before reaching him? And how had her belongings ended up in the attic of her own home, hidden away without his knowledge? Paul swore he had never been inside the Carter house. He denied any involvement in concealing her things. To detectives, this made him both a key witness and a lingering suspect. Back at the Carter home, the revelations hit like a storm. Daniel, long under suspicion, now faced the possibility that his wife had been preparing to abandon him for another man. The children, already fractured by years of grief, reeled at the image of their mother planning a life in secret. The daughter clung to the hope that the discovery meant Emily had been alive longer than they thought. The son, however, saw betrayal, an explanation for why their family had been torn apart. Their father's silence grew heavier, his eyes darker, as he processed the idea that detectives were now circling back to him with more pointed questions. If Emily had been afraid of him discovering her affair, then his motives suddenly looked sharper. Detectives pressed Paul about the letters, about whether he had written or influenced them, but forensic analysis confirmed Emily's handwriting. They pressed Daniel about his knowledge of the trunk, about whether he had known it was there, but he denied it, again and again. The investigation teetered between 2 men, one who admitted to an affair but claimed innocence in her disappearance, and one who maintained ignorance but had every reason to feel betrayed. For the Carter children, it became unbearable to live between these competing truths. Their mother had been more complicated than the image they clung to. Their father's innocence was no longer certain. And yet, the one man who admitted to being part of Emily's secret life still swore he had no role in her vanishing. It left the case suspended once again, but this time with sharper edges. The purse, the letters, the photograph. They had all pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight. And as detectives prepared their next steps, one conclusion loomed larger than all the others. The truth of what happened to Emily Carter was not buried in distant forests or unknown highways. It was buried within the lives of those who had known her best, and someone among them had been holding on to a secret for far too long. Detectives could not ignore the attic evidence: the purse, the letters, the photograph. Each one tied Emily's disappearance back to her own home, back to her family, back to her husband. After years of suspicion, they brought Daniel Carter in again, this time with sharper questions and evidence laid bare on the table in front of him. He sat in silence at first, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the purse that had once belonged to his wife. When pressed about how those belongings had ended up hidden in the attic, his face shifted, the composure he had carried for a decade slowly unraveling. The interrogation stretched into hours. Detectives reminded him that dust analysis placed the trunk's concealment within days of Emily's disappearance. They reminded him that Emily's letters spoke of fear of him discovering her secret life. They reminded him that the affair was real, confirmed by Paul Harrison, the man she had planned to leave with that night. With every detail laid bare, Daniel's defenses cracked. Finally, his voice broke. He whispered words that changed everything. Emily had come home that evening. She had returned, briefly, before she vanished for good. According to his confession, Emily had walked back into the house after leaving the grocery store, carrying the single bag she'd purchased. She told him she was leaving, that she could no longer stay in a marriage suffocated by arguments and silence. He said she admitted to the affair, that she was planning to walk away with someone else. In that moment, something inside him snapped. A rage he claimed he had never felt before boiled over. He struck her, a single blow meant to stop the words, but instead ending her life. The silence afterward was heavier than anything he could bear. He described panic, fear of losing everything, fear of being seen as a monster. In desperation, he hid her belongings in the attic, wedging the trunk into the beams where he believed no one would ever find it. Then, under the cover of darkness, he drove her body to a remote property owned by his family, miles from town. There, he buried her in a shallow grave, convinced that the truth would remain hidden forever. For 10 years he carried that secret, watching his children suffer, watching suspicion fall on him again and again, but never speaking the words aloud. And it was only when the attic finally gave up its secret that he could no longer deny it. Search teams followed his directions to the remote site. Within days, they unearthed human remains, confirmed through dental records to be Emily Carter. Forensic analysis matched his confession, leaving no doubt. After a decade of mystery, the truth was no longer speculation. Emily had not been abducted by a stranger or vanished into a new life. She had returned home, and home was where her life had ended. For the Carter children, the revelation was shattering. 10 years of grief and uncertainty collapsed into a single truth, one that carried both closure and unbearable betrayal. Their mother had been taken not by chance, but by the man they had lived beside every day since.